The key is that you have to see the mistake as an opportunity to learn. You don't want to see the mistake as evidence that you have a bad ability. You want to be able to focus your efforts on the right answer as opposed to getting mad at yourself and kicking yourself. That doesn't help you. We don't really do a great job of incentivizing people to try and fail.
That's Dr. Charan Ranganath. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience and director of the Dynamic Memory Lab at the University of California, Davis. For over 25 years, Dr. Ranganath has studied the mechanisms in the brain that allow us to remember past events using brain imaging techniques, computational modeling, and studies of patients with memory disorders. So you'll learn 1, how emotions shape memory, 2, how to hack your brain for enhanced retention, and 3, the 4 C's of memorable messaging. And if you want to get a quick summary recap of some of these items, I recommend you sign up for the free Gold Nugget email newsletter found at awesomeatyourjob.com. I'm Pete Makaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Charan. Charan, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to hear what you've got to say about memory in your book, Why We Remember. And could you kick us off with a particularly fascinating insight you've discovered about us humans and memory from all of your research?
2 things that I think are particularly interesting. One is our really recent research is showing how much we reuse the same kinds of elements across different kinds of memories. In other words, you'd think, like, if I take a bunch of pictures of my dog, my phone will store different photos of my dog. It doesn't reuse the same space on my phone for multiple pictures. But my brain is really using a lot of the same elements across multiple memories that overlap. So memory seems more like a structure that you would build out of Legos. And you could just as easily take those Legos apart and use some of the same Legos to build something completely different, right? And that's, I think, what I'm most excited about right now is just seeing how economical our brains are. It's not laying down something brand new for every event that we experience. It's really doing a lot of recombination.
That is really intriguing. And then there could be some interesting implications there associated with misremembering things. Like if your brain has a Lego block for your dog, and then your dog may have had a very different facial expression, posture, whatever, in a particular memory. But if you're using a more generic dog memory, then those nuances are not present and perhaps more prone to distortion. I'm just totally speculating, making things up here.
No, that's absolutely true. In fact, what happens often is as people remember the same event multiple times, the memory drifts more and more towards what people kind of knew beforehand. And you get less and less of the details that are unique to a particular event. So what we think the brain is doing is it's taking this kind of a template and then it's tacking on some details that make this particular moment unique. And so you might remember something specific about what your dog actually did the last time you took your dog for a walk. But most of that memory, the backbone of it, is going to be based on just my general knowledge of what happens when I walk the dog and the expectations that I have about it. And if you actually look at brain scans of people who are, let's say, watching a movie, what you find is that if people remember the movie, you're using a lot of those same Legos as you do when you're watching the movie. And then if you ask people to imagine something completely new, we think what's going to happen is that you use some of those same Legos again to imagine something that hasn't happened. In other words, when we remember, we're using those Legos basically to assemble a little model of the past, to imagine how the past could have been. But you could just easily take those Legos and assemble a little model of the future, or assemble a little model of what's happening right now. And I think that's a pretty profound idea that we're very excited about.
Well, then that gets me thinking about the sort of like the state or mood that we're in and how that's influenced by what we're focusing on. and whether in the present or what we're choosing to reminisce about, whether that was a very pleasant or unpleasant experience, or what we choose to imagine about the future, whether that's a worry or a visualization of a dramatic victory that you're going through. So that would seem to imply that we have a tremendous power within us in terms of what we choose to focus on and visualize, and the moods and, I guess, vibe presence that we bring into a given moment. Is that accurate?
No, that's totally accurate. Yeah. In fact, what you can find is that when people remember an event, you can say, hey, try to remember it from the perspective of this other person who was part of the event. And people will remember a lot of details that they didn't remember before. So we can always reframe and revise our memories of the past by looking at it from a different perspective, right? But likewise, what can happen, especially when we're in particularly emotional experiences, is the emotion kind of puts us in a particular frame of mind and filters a lot of the way that we think about the memory later on. So I think with emotional memories, especially more difficult memories, people feel a bit stuck. And often you need to actually talk about that information with someone else to be able to incorporate a different perspective and see that experience from a different way of thinking.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is just intrinsically fascinating stuff. We could poke and dive into all kinds of tidbits, but how about you give us the broad frame for it? What's sort of the big idea or core message from your book, Why We Remember?
The core message is that memory isn't this repository of the past that is keeping a comprehensive library of everything that we've experienced it as we've experienced it. It's much more about the present and the future than it is about the past. And so the analogy that it took me months after writing the book, but I really like it because in the months after publishing the book, I've been traveling a lot. And one of the things I came to notice is that when I'm packing, I've become very good at anticipating what I'll need. And so you don't want to pack too much because then you're lugging around a bunch of stuff. And if you pack really too much, you'll never find what you're looking for, right? And you don't want to underpack and miss out on the stuff that you need that you're going to use all the time. And I think it's like people approach memory like as if we're supposed to take everything we've ever experienced with us on the journey of life, right? And I think our brains are much more designed to pack just what you need so that you have it when you need it, right? I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that I own that I like my lamp and stuff like that, that I'm not going to take with me when I go on trips. And I think our brains are really designed to take what we need and to leave a lot of the rest behind so that we have the information that we need when we need it in the future.
That's interesting. And yet it seems sometimes I have memories that seem to be not at all helpful and in fact counterproductive that I would like to forget. What's this about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And sometimes those counterproductive memories can be because we just happen to be zoning out and paying attention to something and got excited about some random factoid during the moment. And that excitement can actually create a memory or kind of improve your ability to remember something later on. Sometimes it's because we're not focusing on what we're supposed to be focusing on. And so we end up going on these, having difficulty filtering out our experiences. And in fact, there's some work suggesting that as people get older, that inability to filter out what's irrelevant means that you end up remembering stuff that's irrelevant at the expense of the stuff that's important and relevant. So that could be a factor too. But you can also think of it like we don't necessarily know what we need later on. And so sometimes our brains are probably just taking their best guess. And it could be because something was just a little surprising and made you go, that's interesting. Or it could be because you're in a particular emotional state at the time, or who knows, right? It's really hard to reverse engineer a particular memory that you might have. But there are all sorts of reasons why you might have access to some memory that seems really random.
Since there's so many dimensions or directions we could take this into, what do you think are some of the top implications of this research for our professional lives and careers?
I think that one big implication is if you're trying to communicate, which is essential to almost all jobs, but especially in knowledge-based jobs, I feel like you need to start with the assumption that most of what you communicate will be forgotten. And so that is very, very important because once you start with that, then you can say, what are the key points that I really want someone to take away? And you can use some strategies to really emphasize those key points over and over again. But I think often what we can get caught up in doing is we just say a lot of things and then we expect everyone to remember them later on. Likewise, one of the things that you find is that people will usually tell me, hey, I have a terrible memory. Help me out. But then in the moment, they assume that everything that's happening, they will remember it later on. So people have this weird overconfidence in how much they'll remember. And so if you're listening to someone else, it's also really important to factor in that you're not going to be able to remember everything. And so that can be very important too, because sometimes you might need help to document all the things that are going on if it's something that's super memorable. I feel like it's really good to rely on devices that have a photographic memory because humans don't. And so when it comes to reminders of things, I think devices are great. Now, there's all sorts of problems with our devices that can cause problems for our memory, but we can talk about that too. I mean, I think that's another big important thing for the workplace for sure.
Well, just because it's hanging in the air. Problems with these devices, are you talking about like interruptions or what do you mean?
Yeah. So the problems with the devices, the biggest one I would say is interruptions, but not only interruptions that are external, but our own kind of conflicts that are happening in our heads. So in other words, you have a phone. Let's say if I have my phone in front of me and I know I have my phone there, well, that phone is associated with checking email. And if you have a habit of checking email on your phone constantly, even when you're not checking email, you might have an urge to go on the phone and check your email because it's there, it's around. So it's this cue.
It's reminding you of the behavior. So let's go ahead and do it.
Exactly. And so the phone itself isn't the problem, it's the habit that's the problem, right? And likewise, you have social media. If you check social media habitually, if you have social media apps on your phone, every time that phone is around, you've got a little bit of an urge to check it that's going on in the background. One of the weird things I learned about this after I wrote the book, but I'm working on something else now that talks about it is when you do something, let's say that's long and tedious, like we often have to do at work, what tires you out is not necessarily doing the tedious work as much as the fact that our brains start to ask ourselves, okay, what could I be? And I realize this is sounding very unscientific, but there are more mechanistic ways of describing this. But essentially, our brain starts pulling up other options. The longer we persist on something that's not rewarding to us, our brain starts popping up other options. They're going to give us immediate rewards. Our brains really like things that are immediately rewarding as opposed to activities that have some benefit in the long run.
Yeah. Oh, intriguing. Well, could you tell us a story of someone who struggled in some of these dimensions and then implemented some of your approaches and saw a cool transformation as a result?
I can talk about myself
Okay.
as somebody who struggles with all these issues and talk about how I'm trying to transform my life. I mean, it's not easy, right? I get all sorts of messages from people that are labeled urgent. And so it's very hard for me to completely disengage from things like email. In fact, actually, come to think of it, I should quit my email program that's running in the background right now. And I have to say, I don't know how they actually came to this conclusion, but my school, when I was a kid, told my parents that I have ADHD. And this was long before the whole thing where schools had a real benefit in actually assigning these diagnoses. Back then, it was just like nobody even thought about this stuff. So more recently, I've kind of come to terms with that. I sort of stuck that was in the back of my mind for a long time. And then recently, after the book came out, I had some reminders that brought that to mind. And I started to oh, yeah. And then I had this aha moment of all of these things that I do and things that go on in my life that are seriously problematic because of ADHD. And so one of the things that I've done is really tried to engineer my environment. And what I mean by that is I've removed my social media apps from my phone. I was getting really stressed out about the presidential election, so I removed all my news apps from the phone. I've really engaged, remove all the alerts except for things that are calendar alerts. I remove everything else from my phone so that I'm not getting notifications. I have a whole kind of set of things that I do for planning and so forth. But I guess relevant to memory, the biggest things that I do are things that involve minimizing distractions, trying to reduce switching. Switching is very costly to us in terms of our mental resources. And if we switch too much between things, what can happen is that leads us to have very fragmented memories of the activities that we're doing. So that's not a really good thing either. So on an ideal day, I might block off time to do things like social media and email and so forth, and then block off time where I'm going to be doing other activities. So I would say that these are some tools, but I think the biggest thing is that I'm learning that slow thinking is a lot more effective than fast thinking, and really trying to catch myself when I'm going into this like kind of panic mode of all the hundreds of things I have to do, catching myself and then kind of taking one thing at a time. And the reason is that if I am scattered too much and I've got too many things going on that I'm thinking about, I really will have no memory of that day afterwards. So that's a big thing. And I guess another thing I'll say, this is probably the biggest transformation that I've made, is I really think about bigger decisions in life in terms of how I want things to be remembered. And what I mean by that is like, we just all got through the new year. And every time you get to the end of the year, it's natural to reflect on what happened earlier in the year, right? And then people make their resolutions for the next year. And I feel like it's really important to ask yourself, for all the things that we do, is this how I want to remember this year that's gone by? And there's all sorts of activities that we do that we won't remember. And even if we did remember, we won't want to have remembered our lives that way, right? It's not like you sit around and go like, boy, I'm really glad I spent like 4 hours watching TikTok videos or something. Nobody says that, I don't think.
Yeah, this is powerful stuff. Well, so let's put some things into action. Let's say in the course of doing my professional duties, I want to learn some things. I want to develop some skills and recall some key information, tips and tricks, and insights from the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, etc. Like, I'm learning some stuff and I want to remember more of it. What are some best practices?
One of the best practices, I would say, if I had to pick one thing, is give yourself the chance to fail. And what I mean by that is you tend to think, okay, well, and realistically speaking, I mean, it's a very understandable intuition that if I'm trying to remember something, if I'm trying to memorize something, saying it to myself over and over is the best way to do it. But in fact, if you give yourself the chance to try to remember it later on and you don't remember it, and then you give yourself the answer, that's going to give you far better retention of the information than if you didn't give yourself the chance to do it. It's called, I talk about this in my book as error-driven learning. Other people talk about it as active learning. But this error-driven learning principle is so powerful that even before you learn something, if you test yourself on what the answer could be, you'll remember that answer better than if you just try to memorize that answer. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, I hear you. We had Dr. Manu Kapoor on the show and talking about, I think the label he used was productive failure. In this very notion that, and I've noticed it myself ever since he tuned me into it, is that if I do a thing and then fail, and then I learn what happened there, is so much more impactful in terms of, oh, it feels like an epiphany. Like, that's where I went wrong, of course, as opposed to I'm just passively receiving one of thousands of things in the day, which can wash right over me.
Yeah. And it's really funny because in certain activities, it's almost a given that that's going to be the way you want to learn. Like if you're going to be in a play, you don't just sit around and memorize the script. You actually try to recite the lines. And that's when you realize how little you know, but also your brain can repair those memories and optimize them so they're more accessible later on. Or if you're learning to play basketball, you don't watch a bunch of footage, you actually do it, right? And likewise, I think we don't do this with other things. I mean, if you look at school's all about good performance. It's not about learning. It's really about mastery. And I think it's what you really would want to do is be able to encourage people to push themselves to the point where they're getting C's. And then they learn the answer and then they actually get better as a result. But we don't really do that. And so I think that's why there's this intuition out there that we're just supposed to be good at remembering. And that's not true. I mean, you're going to be better at remembering if you fail to remember and then learn from that mistake.
Well, now you got me thinking about my kids and the learning that's happening right now. So I've got my 5-year-old Mary. We have a keyboard, little Casio. She's been playing around on it. And she was trying to learn how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb. And it was so interesting to watch because you get a few notes right and do the wrong one. And she could hear and recognize that it was wrong. And she would sound so frustrated, like, I was like, it's totally okay. I mean, this is just how it works. But in a way that frustration, that moment is in fact quite valuable. Like she is better off for the purposes of learning Mary Had a Little Lamb, as far as I understand it, experiencing that than not experiencing that to cement the learnings.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the key is that you have to, and I know this is kind of a hot topic because of all the stuff with the growth mindset, for instance, but it's absolutely true. The key is that you have to see the mistake as an opportunity to learn. You don't want to see the mistake as evidence that you have a bad ability. You want to see the mistake as, okay, here's how I fix this memory. And that's really key because you want to be able to focus your efforts on the right answer as opposed to simply like just getting mad at yourself and kicking yourself. That doesn't help you. And so what's important about that is, again, we don't really do a great job of incentivizing people to try and fail. And at the same time, I think it's also important in the Mary Had a Little Lamb case, it's good to have a teacher who can actually say, here's how you should do it. Yeah. On the other hand, if she knows how to do it, she could take a moment to slow down and then say, okay, here's where I made the mistake. Let me try this again and focus on the right answer. And that is where, again, you can get the biggest gains.
Certainly. Well, and I was also talking about kids and learning. I was inside the Khan Academy app. And so my other child, Johnny, we were doing some math stuff. And I had this thoughts about productive failure in my mind. And I noticed just from top to bottom, the sequencing is first, here's the video of how to do the math problems. And here are some math problems to do. And I wondered, not to think that I know better than the mighty Sal Khan, but it's like, would it be better if this were completely flipped in terms of try to do these math problems and fail miserably? Now, hey, here's how to do them. That might be a better way to learn, even though it's the exact opposite of what I've done in my learning and how the app is set up. What are your thoughts?
Yes, yeah, I absolutely think that would be the case. It might be better to give yourself the chance to screw up and then after each problem get here's how you do it. And then get another problem because this is a general skill that you're trying to lose. I'm sorry, that you're trying to learn. You could give the question, give yourself a chance to screw up, get here's how you do it, then get a similar question and then screw up, and then here's how you do it again. And keep giving yourself those opportunities and keep bringing up. I mean, the algorithms could easily bring up the ones that you've struggled with the most and give you very similar problems. And I think that's a much more effective way to learn than to, it's still good that they include those tests in there, but I think it would be better if you could really optimize it in a way that's sort of pushing people to struggle a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's flip it. Let's say we are the dispenser of wisdom, knowledge, information as a presentation or training or any form of communication. You said it really is helpful to think about, given most people will forget most of what we have to say, really hone in on the top key messages that we wish to be remembered. Do you have any pro tips on how we implement that in practice?
Yes. And in fact, I actually wrote an article about this in Harvard Business Review. I think it was the 4 C's of memorable messaging. That's what I called it. Okay, so one is chunking. So chunking is a principle by which you take all the things that you're like, let's say if I'm presenting information and there's all these details, you want to be able to explicitly tie it into like one chunk, right? So for instance, what you can do is you can start to say, okay, here's a general principle. I'm trying to tell people to basically try to take care of their brain health. And I'm trying to remember what all the things are that I would tell people because there's 100 different facts I can tell people about how to improve their brain health. Well, one of the key principles is your brain's a body part. So what's good for your body is good for your brain. Now you start for that and you can say, okay, well, what's good for my heart? Oh, yeah. So doing all these things to reduce your blood pressure, to reduce your cholesterol and so forth. Those are things that you could do to improve your brain health. So, and then another one is callbacks, where you want to keep going back to what you said previously. So now people have to take a moment to remember what they were just being, that what you told them about 5 minutes ago. And they're tying together what's happening now with what's happening then. And again, you're creating this little chunk of knowledge, right? Another is curiosity. And so you were asking me before about one of the discoveries from my lab. And one of the things that we discovered, which really surprised me, was how curiosity can drive learning. And it relates to this error-driven learning stuff that we talked about, where we were interested in this idea that being curious is a motivator. And when you look at other motivators, like, people trying to get money, for instance, or people trying to get food, what you find is that you get activity in these areas of the brain that process dopamine. And dopamine isn't really a reward chemical. It's really about energizing you to get a reward and teaching you about what's rewarding. And so what we found is that when you give people a question and they're really curious about the answer to this question, they don't know it, what happens is there's an increase in activity in the areas of the brain that process dopamine. And it's triggered, as I said, by the question, not by the answer per se. Now, if the answer is surprising, then you might get more of an effect. But in general, just getting a question can energize people and drive them to find the answer. And when they're in that state of curiosity, they'll be better at memorizing things that they're not even curious about. So if you can start off by getting people interested in the question before you give them the answer, that's really important. And so, for instance, when I wrote my book, I had to relearn this principle and I had to really think about, okay, what are the counterintuitives in memory research? Because once you highlight a counterintuitive, then you can start to get people thinking about your points in a way that gets them more likely to stick because they really are going to be curious to find out the answers to these questions. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. Yeah. And I'm thinking about Yeah, I believe Bob Cialdini in his book Influence mentioned that this was an approach he liked to use in the classroom in terms of he generates a question and then deepens it a little bit, so it's like a full-blown mystery. And some YouTubers do this very well in terms of like they're like many documentaries. And so that's a good tip, is like we start with the question, but then help me out if we ask a question, but then sometimes when I hear a question I just don't care at all. And so then it feels like I'm not getting the benefit of that curiosity in terms of, okay, you asked a question, who don't care. So I guess that's a tricky number.
Well, so the question needs to trigger curiosity.
Yeah.
And for people to be curious, you have to hit this sweet spot, because if it's something where you have just no knowledge about anything in that area, well, you're not going to necessarily be curious about it because, yeah, of course, I don't know the question. So I don't know the answer to this question. And if you know the answer to the question, then you're not going to be curious if it's obvious. Where you really want to get people is where there's a gap between what you've just told them and what they need to know to answer the question. And that gap should be something that is bridgeable. So one way you can do it is by highlighting this thing that people go, I hadn't thought about that, or I thought I knew this topic, but now there's something I realized that I didn't know. So I'm just pulling something out from just random. But if somebody were really into the Beatles and you said, hey, do you know the lyrics to the song? And they hadn't heard that song, they would be really curious about it, right? But another way to go is to also be able to say, hey, there's this thing that you thought you knew, but in fact, I'm going to flip it on its head. And in fact, I'm going to ask this question that really prompts you to realize that there's an error in what you thought you knew. So in general, these tools to increase curiosity are driving what's called prediction error, which is essentially you're expecting to know the answer to something. And then there's all of a sudden this gap between what you knew and what you're actually getting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's actually perfect. Thank you. In terms of, I'm thinking about, I've had some podcast sponsors for like really deep software technology things as come through the agencies like, hey, do you want this sponsor? And then I go to their website. It's like, I have no idea what they're even saying about some deep cloud architecture, something or another. And so they may very well be solving an important problem for somebody. But I feel like I'm not your guy to speak this advertisement, because if I don't know what it is, I'm not going to be compelling, and I can't vet it properly in terms of whether it really is a good, cool thing or not. And so then there's no curiosity because like I don't have a clue. I'm not even on the same map. And then on the flip side, if I have full knowledge, they're like, hey, Pete, you're a podcaster. Do you know the number one thing podcasters do to grow their audience? Like, yes, I do. So it's like, you were trying to make me curious, but you failed because I already know it. So I think that's perfect with the gap. And in fact, you're identifying one of my favorite types of book, which is an event occurred some time ago, and we have some perspective on that in deep layers in terms of the author went deep with the interviews of the people like Bethany McLean. Her books are so great. Like The Smartest Guys in the Room about Enron. It's like, oh, I know, I've heard about Enron. Well, here's what really went down and all the details. Or the housing finance crisis in 2008. It's like, oh yeah, I kind of know a little bit about it. It's like, no, here's all the detail. And so Bethany McLean just lays it all out for me. I love it. And it's exactly that. It's like I have some knowledge of the thing, but there's some gaps, and she fills them with gusto, and it's a delightful experience.
Yeah. And, I think it's like in the current age of the internet, you have to be careful because it's like, I know for me, I've seen enough stuff now where it's like people sell a book and they say everything you used to know about this topic is wrong. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a little bit of fatigue that you get from reading those kinds of things. But to the extent that you can highlight a genuine counterintuitive or a genuine gap that people just hadn't actually thought about, I think that's going to be effective at triggering curiosity. And your example actually brought up something else, which is another point I talk about is making things concrete. So your example of the AI companies, if you're talking about these very abstract concepts, it's really hard for people to remember that stuff. But if you give people a concrete story or a concrete example, they're going to be much more likely to remember that. And in fact, it's going to dominate their judgments about whatever it is you're telling them about because it's going to be so memorable, right? So when I wrote my book, this was a big challenge because in science, we're often in our heads in this very abstract world and we're trying to make these arguments about things that are very not tangible. And I had to come up with stories, which, you try to write from your experiences. So there are stories from my life all through the book that talk about all these crazy things, but those stories make concrete some point that I'm trying to convey, or they open up this question that people wouldn't have necessarily thought about, and again, trigger their curiosity. But either way, that concrete story, especially if it's emotionally engaging, it will plant itself in people's memory. And then anything that you attach to that story now becomes more memorable too.
And it also helps explain why I can binge watch TV shows, because the gap is what's going to happen to this character. I'm situated. I've got the scene. I know the context, the environment, the stakes, what they're trying to accomplish. But what I don't know is how it's going to turn out. And I might just have to watch many episodes to satisfy that.
And that's why if you're watching something with commercials, they always stack the commercials towards the end, because by that time you've built up enough knowledge about what's happening that you're really urgently trying to figure out what's happening. And so if you put a gap there and you have a commercial break, people are in the state of curiosity. And in some sense, they're going to be more receptive to that commercial.
Speaking of commercials, a big thanks to Charan for sharing his wisdom with us, and a big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsored checkout is Acorns. If you've got a New Year's resolution to save more money this 2025, don't be among the 92% who fail. Become awesome at saving your money with Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing, so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. And it doesn't take much time at all. I find the Acorns site and app to be beautiful, easy, convenient. NerdWallet rates them excellently, and so do I. So head over to acorns.com/awesome or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. And a little disclosure here, paid on client endorsement, compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/awesome. One sponsor to check out is EarthBreeze. I recently saw a spooky documentary about the avalanche of plastic we throw away or try to recycle, but doesn't really get recycled. So I've been trying to cut back. And the most delightful way I've been cutting back has been foregoing those huge laundry detergent bottles for EarthBreeze detergent sheets. EarthBreeze detergent comes in convenient plastic-free packaging, so they're more eco-friendly than traditional detergent. And I just love how quick and easy and portable they are. I can keep some loaded in my suitcase for an Airbnb or travel laundry emergency. I'm ready. And I save a good 20 seconds of carefully trying to pour and measure liquid detergent into the machine by tossing a quick and easy sheet in there. I love their scent-free version, which is easy on my clothes and skin. So check out EarthBreeze for an easy way to get clean clothes without all the plastic waste. And get 40% off with your subscription at earthbreeze.com/awesome. That's earthbreeze.com/awesome. Yeah. Well, Charan, before we hear about some of your favorite things, any key things you want to make sure to mention or put out there?
I would say one big one is, since we've been talking about AI, humans are very different in the way that we learn and remember relative to machine learning. And I think I like to get this point out. I don't get enough opportunities to say it because there's just so much hype and frankly, a lot of bullshit. There's so much bullshit out there about AI and this concept of artificial general intelligence, which is a very dumb concept. Because essentially, if you look at the kind of constraints on machine learning and the constraints of human learning, they're very, very different. And realistically speaking, humans are dumb in many ways that machines aren't, and machines are really dumb in ways that humans aren't. So I realize that you need to have a lot of humility when you talk about where technology is going, because there's lots of stuff we haven't been able to foresee. But the thing is that the human brain basically evolved to get certain things done, basically to propagate our genes, to keep us alive long enough to propagate our genes and to get the offspring protected and so forth, and be able to help us find a mate, right? Machine learning doesn't have those constraints. And so machine learning doesn't have the same resource limitations. I mean, if you look at like ChatGPT, it can take down an entire power grid. I mean, the carbon footprint is huge. My brain is using less power than an incandescent light bulb. it's just orders of magnitude different, right? And people will say, oh, well, that's because we just need neuromorphic computing and everything will figure itself out. And that's just not true. The principle of human learning is we try to get as much information as possible from as little information as possible. And so there's this kind of sense in AI where it's like we just dump enough training data and these machines can do everything. And humans are like constantly reducing the amount of data that they get, the amount of data they process and work with. But we're doing it in a way that's fairly intelligent. It's optimized for the information that's new and surprising. It's driven by things that are biologically significant to us. And so, you can hook up a camera to a kid and use the video information to train like a state-of-the-art AI system, and it's going to do all sorts of interesting things. But that's because the kid's done the hard work of looking at everything that's important. And so ChatGPT can do a lot of cool stuff, but that's because humans reasoned about all these things, put it in writing, and then it's just memorizing what we've given it, right? So
yeah, you don't get the credit for all that.
Exactly. Now, that doesn't mean that, algorithms in general are consistent and they can have a memory that is more faithful to what it's been trained on than humans can be, right? And humans have all sorts of biases, because I have a whole chapter talking about this, that there's a lot of learning that happens under the hood in our brain that we're not necessarily aware of. And that learning can bias us in a lot of ways. It can make us go for things that are very familiar. Like if you hear about, you hear the word Budweiser over and over again, it's going to seem like it should be a better beer than some beer that you've never heard of before, because if it just is a generic store beer. And of course, for people who are into beer, they might not think Budweiser is good. But the point is that Budweiser advertises, even though you think everyone knows what Budweiser is. But Budweiser advertises because if you say that, you get that name out in front of people and you put some image in front of people enough, maybe you're going to be 5% more likely to pick out Budweiser than Miller Lite at the grocery store, right? And that translates to a huge amount of sales. So I think that's something where humans are really susceptible, is in our biases.
Well, Charan, this is fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for sharing the time with us, and I wish you many happy memories.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun, and it was a memorable conversation.
I really love what Charan had to say about emotion and memory. And what I find so interesting is sometimes when I find myself procrastinating, avoiding a task, and I get all curious about it, like, what's going on? What's that about? Why? What is this? What's behind this? Why might I be resisting it? I over-question it. And often I'm finding more and more, in light of this conversation with emotion and memory, is that the answer is very simple in terms of, well, the last time I did something similar to this, it created kind of a mess. It was unpleasant. It took a lot longer than I thought it would. And some people were upset. And so, I just kind of don't want to do that again. There's no deep psychological soul searching that needs to be done. It's just that simple. And with that insight, it's like, oh, okay, well, then what are my options? I can just bear down and tackle it, or have some knowledge that, oh, yeah, that could happen. Let's plan for it. Let's put a little extra buffer time, not trying to shove this in a tight time window. where things can become problematic if things do take longer, etc. So great to recall that emotion and memory go together. And sometimes I'm finding more and more it's the emotion that gets triggered even before the conscious memory of what's up. And so by digging into that, I can plow through aversive tasks, stuff I'm resisting or avoiding all the more readily. It's not too hard. It's just last time it went not so well. So be ready for that. Okay, noted. Proceeding. If you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP1025. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.